Larry, we've heard a good deal about big success, I think, in Tunisia, some problems in Egypt. How does this fit into the bigger picture?
Okay, well, Dan, thank you for setting me up. Let me begin by thanking Kate Seeley and her colleagues at the Middle East Institute for the wonderful job of organizing this incredibly large, important and timely meeting. And also I just want to say what an honor it is to be on the same panel as Esraa, Abdel, Fattah, and my longtime friend Radwan Masmoudi. Both of these individuals have really, I think, been in important leadership roles in trying to move their countries toward democracy. You've heard their passion and their very keen analysis, and I want to thank them. I want to talk about some of the challenges underlying these transitions, particularly for the three countries, I think, that are on our minds now: Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. But of course, if we get breakthrough in Syria or breakthrough in Yemen in different ways, because there's enormous variety among these Arab countries, these challenges will arise. I think that there may be a breakthrough in Morocco in the coming years from the non-democracy that they have now, even in the wake of this so-called constitutional reform, to a real one. And I think if it were to come, many of the same dynamics you were talking about, Radwan, in terms of Tunisia might apply there. First of all, let me say, you can't get a good transition to democracy out of a climate of lawlessness, chaos, and abuse of human rights. And so I think it's very important to be mindful of the warnings and concerns that Esraa and her colleagues in Egypt are expressing, that I have no doubt that Saadettin Ibrahim would have expressed if he had been here, about the continuing abuses of human rights and civil liberties that are going on in Egypt now, torture by the state security apparatus that is still going on now, bloggers being detained and arrested, a climate of fear that has not been entirely lifted. I think those who alluded to this earlier are right. We do have leverage. Michele, I think you made this extremely important point with the SCAF, and I think one of the mistakes of American foreign policy in the last 30 years has been to constantly underestimate our leverage. One can't dispute, and we certainly should acknowledge right away the cautionary note that Ron Schlicker issued in the last session, that we have to balance our principles and our values with our obvious strategic interests. I'm not saying we should suspend all military aid to Egypt, but I think we can push harder than we have been. And I think when the SCAF comes to us and says that they have to have again the right that the Mubarak regime had, and then the Bush administration was able to wrest away for a period of time, to veto all of our grants to civil society organizations, I think we have to push back harder than the Obama administration has done in the last 10 months. And I think that if we can't get that lifted, there's another way to do it. The Egyptian government doesn't veto the grants to civil society organizations that come from the National Endowment for Democracy and other non-governmental organizations. And so if we can't do it through USAID, I think we need to move some of the money into other vehicles. With respect to Libya, the situation, Dan, you're going to appreciate what I'm about to say, just looks too much like Iraq in the summer of 2003 in terms of the collapse of the state and the disorder and the rampant proliferation of militias. There's really, there are certainly very few challenges in Libya now that are more important than DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of these militias into an authoritative and legitimate army and police that have a monopoly over the means of violence in the country. And one of the things I think we've learned in Iraq, one of the things that Dan and his colleagues have certainly acknowledged when he was at the U.S. Institute of Peace, it's one of the, I'd say, more important and perhaps more neglected lines of research that went on at USIP that really needs to be consulted here is the need for effective policing and the role that international assistance can provide in reconstructing on a new foundation of ethics and capacity a national police force that's capable of maintaining order without violating human rights and that is, mindful of the rule of law. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is constitution making, and here again the U.S. Institute of Peace organized a very important project some years ago on processes of constitution making. I'm not sure what all the outputs are, you might tell us, Dan, but one of them was an article that we published in the Journal of Democracy about 5 or 6 years ago by one of the participants in that process, Jamal Benamar, and synthesizing many of the case studies and lessons that the U.S. Institute of Peace project brought together in the mid-portion of the last decade. Jamal, who's with the United Nations, emphasized the importance, in very sage advice, of an open, inclusive, participatory, and legitimate process of constitution making, which is what I think is going to unfold in Tunisia, in part because they've had democratic elections, and there's going to be a constituent assembly and constitution drafting process that emerges out of that. If you have the kind of flawed and contaminated elections that some of us are worried may unfold in Egypt, and the concerns that Esraa raised, if we even have the elections completely unfold, then inevitably the constitution-making process that results will be flawed. And let me just remind all of us, let's remind ourselves of the heavy price that Iraq paid during the constitution-making process of leaving an important group out of it that was underrepresented as a result of flawed elections there in January of 2005, which could have been and should have been anticipated, and that proved extremely difficult to repair and was a major stimulus to the explosion of violence that happened, or escalated, I should say more correctly, after the constitutional referendum there in October of 2005. So it's very important to have a legitimate body draft the Constitution and to encourage open public participation, dialogue, hopefully compromise. Use this not only as a participation exercise, but as a learning exercise for the society. Now, third, let me say some things, offer some propositions, if you will, about the content of the Constitution and institutions that the emerging democracies of the Arab world might wish to think about or pay attention to. First of all, I think if you look at the history of the extreme concentration and abuse of power in Arab states over the last 50, 60 years or so, you certainly come away with a sensitivity to the need to keep that from happening all over again, to encourage constitutional designs that have ready and facilitating mechanisms to oversee and constrain executive power. And I think the bias should be for purely parliamentary over presidential systems. If you have a semi-presidential system, I think there was an at least implicit reference to this in Egypt, it's likely to become a presidential system all over again. And even in Iraq, we see with the unfortunate trends of political leadership under Prime Minister al-Maliki that there's no intrinsic break on the prime ministership itself being used for a potential hegemonic role, but at least it's harder in a parliamentary system with multiple political parties and the kinds of electoral institutions I'll recognize. I think there are things that can be done to facilitate obvious concerns about political stability and governability in a context where you have multiple political parties in a parliamentary system, and so inevitably there's going to be a problem of coalition formation and coalition sustainability. One of the models that has diffused in the world from the German political system, which I think has been one of the most successful experiments in democratic constitutional design, probably in the history of democracy. I would really almost put it at a level of the American Constitution in terms of its success and its influence, or maybe even above it, given what we're going through now, is the innovation of the constructive vote of no confidence. So in Germany, you can't bring down a government in the parliamentary system unless the vote of no confidence is also able to have, going along with it, a coalition to elect a new government. So that kind of opportunism that promotes parliamentary instability can be preempted. In terms of electoral system design, there has been a trend in the region and in constitutional thinking. This started in Iraq, and I think the general principle was a wise one for proportional representation, and pretty proportional representation. That is with a very, very low electoral threshold. I think this is a wise approach. I think that if you're worried about hegemony or illiberal tendencies, then having an electoral system in which parties basically get the share of seats that corresponds to their share of the vote would be a good thing. One of the things worth noting is that the proportion of the vote that Ennahda got on October 23rd was not that much lower than what Hamas got in Palestine in early 2006. And the difference was that Palestine had, because Fattah thought they were going to benefit from this seat bonus, an electoral system that inflated the majority of the plurality winner, or inflated the proportion into a majority. And PR allows for more pluralism. PR presents some natural breaks on the trend toward the emergence of artificial majorities. I'd say this is a healthy thing. PR facilitates, as has happened in Iraq very dramatically, it's a rather underreported story, and has now happened in Tunisia, more entry of women into parliament, which is an extremely important goal. And as Michele referred to, the problem with Egypt now, one of the many problems, is not just, well, you could say maybe 2/3 of the seats, is that what it is, coming from PR? You know, it's not an unreasonable balance, but the system is so complicated. As I understand it, you know, 2 ballots, 2 rounds, different timing, you know, different tiers. I mean, you know, it would be hard for me to figure it out, much less an ordinary Egyptian voter who's coming to kind of real democratic elections fairly new to the game. So simplicity is actually a very important criterion here for the success of electoral system design. And I think if you're going to use proportional representation, there's something to be said or considered for at least partially open lists to break the potential for leaders to not be very democratically accountable when they draw up their lists and then just order the members of the list around. The third item on the agenda of constitutional design that I'd like to put forward is the importance of strong institutions of horizontal accountability to constrain the potential for concentration and abuse of executive power. And having a parliament with real independent authority in the Constitution is one mechanism, but having strong autonomous constitutional courts and court systems that are mainly secular in their spirit and design and focus, strong institutions to control corruption, which has been and will be a major challenge to governance going forward in the Arab world, including in emerging democracies, with strong independent counter-corruption commissions, state audit commissions, human rights commissions, ombudsman, and freedom of information laws. There are models out there of these kinds of institutions that can work, and the very subtle details in how to structure them and design them so they really have at least some chance of working to constrain power and promote transparency and accountability. The fourth challenge is to work very hard to develop the organizational infrastructure and the normative foundations of a democratic culture and civil society. I think this is too often neglected in this work, where the focus is on the high level of politics, the Constitution, the party system, and so on. But there is going on in these countries now an ideological and normative struggle for the future. There is money pouring in to Egypt and some of these other countries from places in the region. I don't think I need to name the one in particular, funding a radical Islamist, I'm not talking about even the Muslim Brotherhood, but Salafi-oriented, puritanical, extremely illiberal, and ultimately, I think, profoundly anti-democratic vision of these countries. And I don't think that kind of money, which has done so much damage to the political culture and societal prospects for democracy in Pakistan and Afghanistan, should be allowed to be the only financial flow of influence, oh, thank you, Dan, shaping the future. So this involves a lot of efforts to not only support civil society organizations that are working in a variety of ways to promote democratic culture, but also to promote exchanges among colleges and universities, overseas study, and very importantly, I'd love to see somebody take on the challenge of not only accelerating the translation of academic and more popular literature on democracy into Arabic, but just trying to document what we have. I've really encountered an extremely difficult challenge in trying to understand what exists in Arabic so that we can accelerate it and not duplicate efforts. I'd just like to say one last thing in conclusion. I want to strongly endorse what Radwan has said and what a questioner said in the previous session about Tunisia. If there is going to be an Arab democracy in the next 2 years or 3 years, it almost certainly is going to be Tunisia. And if there does not emerge a genuine Arab democracy in the next few years, I know this is going to sound tautological, but you'll understand what I'm saying. It's going to be very hard to get one. That is, it's going to be very hard to stimulate, encourage, and sustain democratic progress in the Arab world. Models matter. Regional diffusion effects have been very, very powerful and important in driving democratic change elsewhere in the world. And mainly, it's within regions that these effects happen. It's been wonderful to have as a model and inspiration what's been happening in Turkey of a vibrant and economically dynamic democracy with a moderately Islamist party that has precisely the orientation you described and that Ennahda now seems to have. But in the end, Turkey is not an Arab country, and Tunisia is. And it may not be as powerful and important and central as Egypt, but I think the example of a successful Arab democracy that is reconciling these different tensions of Islamic faith but a civil state, as you described it, Radwan, is absolutely vital to the future. So Millennium Challenge account, free trade, exchanges, you know, let's all get on an airplane and go to Tunisia and take our next vacation, because making this, country succeed democratically and revive economically is one of the most important things we could do in the next couple of years to advance democracy generally in the Arab world. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.